Companies don't do business with strangers by choice. And with Apple and Samsung, it did not go very well for that reason that your partner might be your partners today, might be your competitor tomorrow, but they do it because this is the efficient way. So it's a very important contemporary concept, this idea of mergers, acquisitions, and alliances. And often a company is mismanaged, and rather than die, it gets acquired, and then the new company can add value, hopefully. So, in terms of strategic options, if we want to grow, no manager is ever hired to be a caretaker. As a senior executive, the board, the shareholders, all the stakeholders are expecting a vision and expecting you to drive the organization forward. So you can do that through diversification, you can do it through globalization, or through internal innovation. And to do that, we can do that organically. Spin off, we were, the Faculty of Science, and now we're the Faculty of Engineering and Science. So engineering is an organic development at Macquarie, building engineering, teaching, and research capabilities. We always had an electrical side to it. We invented Wi-Fi here at Macquarie Uni, but it's still an example of organic development. But mergers and acquisitions is very common, but less risky, more reliably are strategic alliances. When they work, they work. When they stop working, well, we part companies. So organic development, building on developing our own capabilities. Certainly, our knowledge is enhanced. We can amortize the investment, such as your ITOs. This will increase the knowledge of the company. Even if it doesn't succeed, hopefully there'll be something learnt. There's no constraints. We have our independence, and it will work within our culture. Corporate entrepreneurship sometimes is a radical change in the organization's business, and here's an interesting example of Easy Group, which was very successful with EasyJet, but went into food. But then the guy the founder had quite a good background in low-cost food distribution, food acquisition and distribution. But that's still an example of organic development. Mergers and acquisitions. So an acquisition, for instance, Westpac acquired St. George. They thought that there'd be a synergy there, and it seems to have worked out quite well. Google bought Nest. Facebook bought Oculus Rift. So very, very common are acquisitions. Sometimes it's a merger. For example, British Airways merged with Iberia to form International Airlines Group. Doesn't sort of roll off the tongue particularly well, but that was thought to be a good idea at the time. Mergers and acquisitions happens in waves, especially when the economy is booming. The reason is, to acquire a company, you have to pay a premium. The shareholders are not going to be interested in parting with their shares at today's price. If you want to acquire a controlling stake, or for a private company too, if you want to acquire the whole company, you have to give me an offer I can't refuse. You have to give me a very good offer. And so it's in bullish times that mergers and acquisitions are have a much higher pace. In terms of mergers and acquisitions, we can extend our reach. American companies appoint European distributors, and European law is very difficult for them, because if they want to establish their own subsidiary, they have to acquire their distributor. The Europeans are very clever, in Western Europe anyway, because they realize the distributor has spent a lot of money Guys, by all means, chat as much as you like. There's some lovely fresh air outside. It's very distracting. So back to acquiring European distributors. The European laws are such that you, without compensating for market introduction fees, your distributor, you can't open your own subsidiary. So the Europeans are well aware of the local companies doing the hard yards in terms of creating a market for an American product. And then it grows, and the American company believes this would be a good investment, and they can't establish their own subsidiary. They have to acquire their distributor, basically. And the head of the distribution company stays on for a period of time as the as the president of the European subsidiary, whichever country it is. So that's an interesting example here of extension in terms of geography. Could be to get more scale, efficiency, market power, or to acquire capabilities. Know-how, very much in the tech industry, it's done to acquire capabilities. So Google saw IoT, smart home, as very important, and acquired Nest. Nest had reached, was very famous with an intelligent thermostat. Works in America, was successful in America. A lot of American homes are in the north, and they get very cold in winter, and so they're heated all throughout winter, and the heating bills, burning oil, whatever it is, whatever type of heating that they're using, gets very expensive. So they have an intelligent thermostat to only heat when there are inhabitants, to detect how many people, understand the pattern of what temperature they would like, etc. Speaking of which, 23 degrees, great. We're heating at the moment, and it's a warm day, and this thing is heating, great. Then again, you can't please all the people all the time. It doesn't even work. We'll just have to perspire through this. Financial motives in terms of financial efficiency, possibly tax efficiency, or in terms of movies like The Wolf of Wall Street, is asset stripping, acquiring a company because they're performing badly at a very good price, and then selling off the assets on the balance sheet, and therefore turning a profit. There's a lot of personal ambition, but often it's a bandwagon effect too. So often a lot of acquisitions, it's the winner's curse that you win, you have the best price in the takeover bid, but it's a curse because you've paid too much. So in turn, there's a target, and then due diligence, negotiations, and then so the satisfactory price is offered, and there's then the change of ownership, and then it creates a huge integration problem. We see this with IS very frequently. Is you have disparate ERP systems, and trying to integrate them can be a nightmare. And results. Logically, you'd say if you've taken two dissimilar organizations and put them together, the results would probably be less for the combined organizations compared to them separately. So we see this if we go back to our airline cases, why we do the cases, they give us some really good examples. We saw organic development when Qantas established Jetstar. Alan Joyce was very successful, and Jetstar is still geographically developing. It's not just domestic, it's an international airline. Flying tomorrow with Jetstar to the Gold Coast. Just got to make sure that my hand luggage is less than 7 kilos, because I'm sure they're going to weigh it. So you know the rules. Everything. I don't want any check-in bag, just overnight. And everything. So Jetstar, very reliable. I know the deal, and incredibly cheap. I mean, like $50, And my neighbour, I met my neighbour in the lift, and he said on the long weekend, they went to the Gold Coast. And he drove. I could have been sarcastic and said, so you spent the whole weekend driving, did you? As soon as you got there, you had to turn around and come back. I said, oh, that would have been fun. He said, oh, yeah. We got back at 1 a.m. They wanted to stop in Byron Bay. And I felt like saying, oh, yeah, that's convenient. But I didn't. I left all the sarcasm is only for Macquarie Uni students, not for neighbours. But I don't want my neighbours hating me, But Jetstar, very, very cost efficient. So that's an example of organic development. It's an example of geographic diversity in extending the reach. But Virgin did the opposite. Virgin acquired Tiger. And Tiger had a reputation for planes that were grounded by CASA, the Civil Aviation Authority. And therefore, with Tiger, the reputation is one of lack of safety and lack of reliability. They probably didn't fly often enough to crash them, and you see it on Webjet. You see it on the portal. There's Tiger there, and then there's Virgin, and Virgin is expensive. Tiger is cheap, but Jetstar is cheap. Why am I going to choose Tiger? Forget it. I'll stay with Jetstar. I know what the deal is. I've got confidence in Jetstar, and I'm a typical consumer. So logically, when you go and acquire another company that is disparate, that's very different to you, why do you expect there to be a synergy? So this is a bit of folly sometimes, managerial folly, that through ambition, the bandwagon effect is discussed. I mean, Johnson's very clever. These guys are smart. They know that it often doesn't work out, but it's a quick way, because Tiger was desperate for someone to acquire the assets. They had the investment in the plane. So it was a deal. But it was ill-conceived. I can see how they sold it. It's a bargain basement price. Pick up this failed airline. Still reaping the penalty. It's still hitting them today, years later. What a mess. It's like building a private hospital on a university campus, That'll bleed forever. So there needs to be strategic fit. And there needs to be an organizational fit for this to work. Negotiation, the winner's curse. You win, but you pay too much. You have to pay this premium for control. So in terms of integration, there's a 2x2 model here. And it depends on the acquired firm level of autonomy that they need and the knowledge transfer. If you are giving them very little knowledge and they need autonomy, you've got to preserve them. You've got to let them do like Google did with Nest. Let them do their thing. I've got Nest cams in the shop, my wife's shop. We can check any time. I was too busy today, didn't bother, but can check any time what's going on, That's extending from the thermostats to the smart cameras, and it's all part of Google Home. I can use the same Google Home app to drive my Chromecast if I want to. If I want to flip between looking at what's happening in the shop and watching TV. I don't know. I mean, the smart home, again, is still something that's evolving. Integrating all of these things will be interesting. If the knowledge transfer is low and they need very low levels of autonomy, then you have to work very hard on them. It's intensive care. If they don't need much autonomy, it's just absorption. And if they're very autonomous and they can give you a lot of knowledge, it's symbiosis. You both benefit. So that's a theoretical 2x2 matrix, as you'll often find. Sometimes there's reorientation acquisitions, like Tiger into Virgin. We have to make you reliable. But what can you do with that reputation? There needs to be a justice in all of this. You see, when you're engaging in these sort of acquisitions, it's incredibly disruptive. So for the acquired firm, they usually get stripped. As an example, I'll give you an example. Fairfax. Fairfax has been Australia's #1 newspaper. The mastheads of the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. The #1 newspapers in the two big capitals. But Fairfax is in dire straits. Why is Fairfax in trouble? They are. Beg your pardon? People don't buy newspapers, for goodness sake. They're not buying newspapers. I pay for a subscription. I love my online newspaper. I try and read it every day. It's available on mobile, tablet. You can even look at the print version just for fun, how it used to look. The print one is interesting because the editor gave you a sense of priority. The headlines. You don't have headlines anymore. You used to have headlines. What's making the news? Front page, page 3. Some traditional newspapers, the Murdoch papers, would have a pretty bikini girl on page 2. See, it's all gone. But those are sort of trashy newspapers. But anyway, back to Fairfax. So because people aren't buying newspapers, because it's a digital era, the revenue is not as high in terms of digital advertising and digital subscriptions. You're competing against, I don't know, free newspapers like BuzzFeed. There's a lot of free news. Anyway, even ABC is quite a good one, the ABC app. It's free. The ABC one doesn't have ads even better still. But huge competition because of the digital era, yet Fairfax have some of the best investigative journalists. There's still a lot of oldies around like me who still enjoy reading the Sydney Morning Herald. So Fairfax is not ready yet for extinction. But now it's part of Nine Entertainment. So how is the culture going to work now that Nine Entertainment owns Fairfax News? So Nine News is entertainment. It's very different to ABC News. If you ever look at the news, I know you guys probably never do. Watch the news. Anybody watch the news? You do? Which news do you watch? What channel?
Sometimes ABC on the app, not TV.
Right, so it's ABC on the app. 7? 7? 7? 7? Entertainment. You guys like the entertainment. It's not really news. Go just for a sense of adventure. Watch ABC. Juanita Phillips at 7 o'clock. And you'll find that its coverage is completely different. It doesn't care about car crashes, about robberies, about cats that got lost. It doesn't care about all this background noise that happens all the time to ordinary things, to ordinary people. That's Schadenfreude, by the way. We like watching people getting into strife. It's a German expression called Schadenfreude. It means taking delight in the misery of others. It makes us feel good when we see other people miserable. Because it didn't happen to us. Oh, my house didn't burn down. Phew. I didn't get robbed. I didn't get run over. Phew. Oh, poor unlucky person. That's why there's entertainment. This news is, from the commercial stations, they're commercial. It's entertainment. It's not journalism. It's just for comparison, for some research, just try it, half an hour, one evening, tune in to Juanita at 7 o'clock. So the cultures are very different when there's an acquisition, and you have to try and be fair. Now, the poor Fairfax journalists, they are going to, a lot of them will be retrenched because there's Nine News, and they're now dealing with an entertainment network, and so therefore getting advertisers. Don't criticize the advertisers. Be nice. Write lots of good advertorial. Write a piece that's very positively slanted to the advertiser, and then we put the ad on the same page. Completely different cultures. It's a disaster. But what can you do? So it can be very problematic when you try and merge the cultures of two very different organizations. And maybe some of the Nine News people are going to feel very uncomfortable because they're just entertainers, they're not real journalists, you know. They'll get bumped, possibly. So lots to think about there in terms of trying to do the right thing. There are serial acquirers, Cisco, IBM, but especially Oracle. Sometimes we need to divest. Sometimes we talked about Wesfarmers, for instance, and they divested their coal mines. That's a good move. And Yancoal acquired the Wesfarmers coal mines. It's a good move. Yancoal is owned by the Chinese government. China wants to secure energy, like Adani in northern Queensland. India, China will still need coal for quite some time. And they feel that possibly the developed countries have created all that carbon dioxide. We're yet to develop. You created the problem, you fix it. Only one small problem with that argument is we all live on the same planet. And those typhoons and floods and catastrophic weather events will hit you worse than us. So we'll see how that all works out. But that's, again, a strategy. So Wesfarmers divested the coal mines. Yancoal acquired them. China for energy security. Don't care. Economic, uneconomic, doesn't matter. We need the energy. Whereas Wesfarmers now, the price is too low, the costs are too high. We're a consumer, more of a consumer company with Bunnings, Officeworks, etc. And sometimes there's a strategic alliance. That works out much better. There's a collaborative advantage. So Apple, the largest consumer electronics company in the world, doesn't manufacture anything. Uses all collaborative strategic alliances. Sometimes there's equity, like Etihad took an equity stake in Virgin. That's not going too well for you, Etihad. Sometimes it's a non-equity alliance, like the One World Frequent Flyer Alliance. Makes more sense. It's a franchising, licensing, subcontracting. Sometimes it's a joint venture. Investing in the company, you draw on their expertise, they need some capital, and you share in the profits. Sometimes it's a consortium that get together because they have a common interest, like the Wi-Fi consortium, everybody adhering to the same standards for interoperability. So this is, what are the rules here? There are no rules. What approach should you take? Well, that depends. It's all an art, and that's why your group assignment's about you persuading me that you've got some good ITOs. And they're good if the business case is sound. They're good based on the context. Non-equity alliances, franchising, Subway's a disaster. They're all closing at the moment because they're just out of fashion. Can't give away. You literally can't give away a Subway shop. There's some of them you can buy for $1 because the owner wants to walk away from the losses, walk away from the fixed overhead from the lease. Licensing, very common in beer brewing, and we have the bottler of Coca-Cola. So Coca Amatil in Australia is the bottler of Coca-Cola. There's no way you're going to ship water and sugar from America to Australia. We have plenty. Our sugar is not cheaper than yours. And water, you know, it comes out of the tap. That's what Coke mainly is, water and sugar. So you just license somebody. You give them the secret formula and you license them. Same thing with beer brewing often. Scale, you often get scale, you get access, it's complementary. Sometimes it's collusive. There's collusion, where you work together at an alliance to keep the prices high. There's probably a bit of collusion, convenient collusion between Jetstar and Virgin, because Virgin want the prices to go up, and so Jetstar is enjoying higher prices. Not that I'm seeing it tomorrow morning. I go to the Gold Coast, $51. I'm not seeing the higher price, but they must be there somewhere because Qantas's profitability is going up. So there's often collusion where the big players want to see prices come up in the market. And here are some graphics just showing the four types. The process can be coevolution. You work together to develop the new products. It certainly requires trust, and it often breaks down because of a lack of trust. There's a cycle here: courtship, negotiation, a startup, and a maintenance, and then a divorce. So it can extend it, can be an amicable separation, or it can be a divorce. All scenarios occur regularly. In terms of acquisitions, alliances, and organic development, here, if there's high urgency, buying or forming an ally is much faster. Do-it-yourself is slow. If there's high uncertainty, here, ally is a very good idea because you share the losses. If it's soft compatibilities are important, the culture here, doing it yourself means you don't have to worry about that. So the green is really the guide here. High modular capabilities, ally, as Apple does. They ally with the relevant partner because they've broken down their products into modules, into components. And there's various allies who have capabilities, and they change, as they develop new products. So the key success factors: strategic fit, organizational fit, not suffering the winner's curse, being able to integrate, being able to evolve together, and knowing when to exit too. So it's very difficult, mergers and acquisitions. They will still keep happening all the time, but quite an art to make them work. But an important aspect of strategy. And we've got one more chapter, evaluating strategies, and then next week is the end of Johnson, 13 and 15. But we've got chapter 12, but you are to read the text, and you'll get general questions relating to the text in your exam. Of course, everybody asks me, what's going to be in the exam? What's the exam going to look like? How do I prepare for the exam? What pages in this 1-inch thick book do I have to read? And not only that, can you give me the answer too, please? Yeah? This is the list of questions that I get from students. Anyway, I answer all those questions with the same answer. You've heard. Who's heard my answer? You've asked the question, obviously, and now you've gotten the answer. Look at past papers, and that is the answer to all your questions. Gives you an idea of the type of question, but you have to understand the theory. I do ask you to apply these concepts, in particular to companies that you've researched in your assignments. I expect you to know something about these organizations. You've researched them. Regrettably, I can't ask students to talk about their work experience because these days we've got a younger cohort. So I don't rely on that, but I do rely on two things. You should have a good knowledge of the companies that you've talked about in your assignments, and you should have a good knowledge of the cases we've discussed in class. And I usually don't ask an exact question from the case studies, but something related to it. So if you've participated in the discussion, you'll have a good awareness of the direction of the case and the sort of things I'm likely to ask. But if you're clueless, that's okay too. Go to past papers. Okay, so strategy in action. These are the learning outcomes here, but we'll cover it. So, we've got our performance, economic and effective. It's never good enough. If you think it's good enough, then you are not leadership material. Simple as that. Greed. This is why I was very pleased to get out of the corporate world. I tired of the quarterly budget cycle, quarterly earnings, short-term thinking, profit, revenue. Get the revenue up, get the costs down, boost the profit. Maybe it's because I worked for two German companies and two American companies. I found the German companies too restrictive. They don't care how you do it, as long as you do it the way that we do it in Germany. Succeed or fail, we don't care, as long as you do it the way we do it in Germany. And works for them in some things. Some things works very well. They engineer products brilliantly. Siemens, Mercedes. But you know, they're not very strong in a lot of other areas. But outside of engineering, they're not very strong because you have to do it the German way. But the Americans are very different. Make a buck. If it's illegal, don't get caught. Oh, they're funny. The Americans are very funny. They're very greedy. And look who they hired, look who they voted for as their president, Mr. Greed himself. It says a lot about American culture. So, if you're working for a US company, Australians are sort of in between the two, you know, it depends. Cultures vary immensely. This university is driven by greed, absolute total greed. Get the bums on the seats, drive the numbers up. More overseas students, the better, because you're a much better return. Your fees are much higher, much higher. More. Drop the entry standards consistently. Make sure that it's always a bell curve. Must always be a bell curve. Centered median is around the low credit, high pass. That's what we want to see. Distinctions, high distinctions, no. Sorry. That's just a bridge too far. Very few of those, please. But the same token is we don't like to fail. So everybody is pushed into the bell. And as entry requirements have dropped over the last decade, pass numbers are identical. So it shows the shift in standard, because the standard is automatically adjusted to the cohort, to the group. It's greed, driven by greed. More. Get us up in the ratings. We need more research. Researchers, costs a fortune. Got to hire fancy schmancy professor so and so to head up his or her research center with the equipment and the research associates. Millions, you're talking about millions to establish all these little research centers that you'll see dotted all around the place here to get those papers published. More. So it's not just Americans. Okay, I see the corollary here. Drive down costs, get the costs down. More bums on seats, bigger class, bigger. Here. We had a discussion. The format next year is changing because we have so many overseas students, so many full-time students. It's going to be more day-orientated, less of the evenings. And I was saying that's great. Let's say if we've got a class of 80, you do 2 tutorials of 40, mandate attendance. No, that's not going to happen, Ian. So why I'm going to have a tutorial of 80? How do I do a case study with 80 students? How do you do it? It's not policy, or each faculty set up their own policy. So they don't even want to split the class into 2 tutorials according to what is, I thought, university policy. You couldn't have more than 40 students in a class, but that varies from faculty. I work for the Department of Teaching, and it's 40, and that's it. And then they run 20 tutorials throughout the week, and I do 3 or 4 in a day and get paid nicely, and it's a lot of fun. But no, Faculty of Science Engineering won't do it that way. It'll be 80, whatever, which means I won't mandate attendance, which means none of you will attend, which means nobody learns anything. So that's still an example here of organizations are often, not all, but often driven by greed. We had the Hayne Royal Commission, into our banks. Commonwealth Bank, our number 1 bank in the country, they were successfully prosecuted for denying insurance claims, using old definitions so they didn't have to pay out on death disability insurance. And they're selling ComInsure. Their reputation is so trash now that they were charging fees. They were charging advisor fees for dead people, deceased estates, and still charging advisor fees. They were charging advisor fees for advice that was never given, but possibly that was potentially available. It's not even available. We have our industry super funds. You'd think, well, they're at least squeaky clean because they're not for profit, they're set up by the unions, and they just exist for their members. And you see all the ads like this, the Diamond Industry Super Funds. Do you know what they do? That during your working life you'll get signed up for multiple superannuation funds, because every time you start a new job, the employer has to pay you 9.5% of your salary into superannuation in Australia. So it's very common that people will have more than one super fund. They automatically charge you for life insurance. Now, if you're in your 20s or 30s, what are you talking? You don't have dependents. There's nobody, no wife and kids dependent upon you. It's very expensive policy. It's not worthwhile. You die, you'll be missed. We'll all be heartbroken, but we don't need to be compensated for your loss. Here, who would you compensate, and how would you compensate them? It's ridiculous, life insurance for young people. Yet every single super fund will automatically deduct life insurance from your policy, even when they know you have multiple funds, and even when they know it can only be paid out once. You die, only one company will pay out. How they decide, I don't know. They knew. It was such a cash cow for them. You didn't even notice it being deducted. Just like the banks, and they're overcharging over fees. What you don't know won't hurt you, so to speak, but it does hurt your hip pocket here. And so greed. So lots of organizations are telcos who overcharge on the data roaming. So it's incredibly abundant, unfortunately. Not sure it's the root of all evil. I wouldn't go that far, but it's problematic. So you can work for an organization that's more socially. We have a triple bottom line. We'll talk about evaluating strategies, and a triple bottom line is a social benefit. And it's good to see this becoming more important. But my point in all of this is economic performance is rarely satisfactory. No matter how well the organization is doing, they want more. Except the Germans, do it like Germany. Don't care whether you succeed or fail, but just do it like us. Oh dear. And so effectiveness. What they want is to drive the top line and reduce cost. Here. So you need to identify the gap, how can you achieve, this is where you are now, this is where we want to be, so that's the gap. And so you need options that are suitable, acceptable, and feasible, and that's how we develop strategies to meet the gap in performance. So we have economic performance in markets. We want sales growth, market share, more students. You know, we lost our students from China. I think the Chinese students are gravitating more to the G8. There's been a lot in the press about the dependence of a lot of our universities on Chinese students, but here at Macquarie, they've really dropped off, but we've tapped into the subcontinent, haven't we? Just look around. Into India, Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh, yes? Subcontinent. Very new. This is only recent. Not so much Iran. No. But delight to have you. So we've been able to, the university's been able to get its growth by tapping into other markets. In terms of profitability, again, a vulnerability of Australian universities is this dependence on overseas students and the high profitability that they deliver. And we want financial measures here for public companies. It's things like share price. So there's lots of financial metrics. But effectiveness, we need to look beyond the financial results. And in the 1980s, Kaplan and his buddy suggested the balanced scorecard. It's like the Hague, I can't remember. Balanced scorecard. It's very old. Balanced scorecard. Even Wikipedia will tell me. You can tell me who suggested it. Yeah, but who invented it? History. No, I don't want that far. Kaplan. I told you it was Kaplan. It was in Kaplan and Norton. Okay, so Kaplan and Norton invented it. I remembered Kaplan at least. So Kaplan and Norton invented it in the 1980s. And the idea, the thinking is that we need to go beyond revenue. Guys, if you've got something to say, put your hand up, contribute. But otherwise, it's really nice fresh air out there. It's hot and stuffy in here. Really, feel free to enjoy it. Just don't disturb us. So, we need metrics about 5 things. Certainly financial performance. So for the university, revenue, student fees, number of effective full-time students, EFTs. How many students do we have? So we normalize. You only do one subject out of a potential of 4, then you're a quarter student. So we work out EFTs, effective full-time students, right? How many? But what's the mix? Domestic versus overseas here. What's the revenue? So those are the financial, but we need much more. What about the customer? How happy are you? So organizations are crazy these days with surveys. You do an inquiry, have any contact with an organization, and boom, they send you an email with a survey. I feel like completing the survey, and when they ask, is there any way we can improve our performance, I'd say, yes, don't send me these annoying surveys. But I guess the question won't be there. I don't know. I hit the delete button. Does anybody fill out those surveys? No. It's a nuisance. It was difficult enough dealing with you. Now I've got to deal with your survey, But they're mad about trying to get metrics on the customer. I was in the Commonwealth Bank the other day, and there was a woman shouting at the teller. She was shouting at him, "What is your name? Give me your name." He wouldn't. I could see. "We'll pass on your complaint. What is your name?" The bank's not serious. They're not in the slightest bit serious about customer complaints. They will fob you off. They have a procedure. They know they can't please all the people all the time. They'll fob you off to complaints. I had a dispute with the bank once on my mother's account. She's 97, No, she's passed away, but she lived to 97. She would have been 95. She would have been a youngster at the time. It would have been 94, 95 or something, and they overcharged $40,000. It's not a small mistake. And they will pass your complaint on, and then they sent back excuse. We didn't advise you of the fee because you were in too much of a hurry to leave the branch. And that's what they put in writing back to me. And of course, I complained to the Ombudsman, and then the response to the banking Ombudsman was that I was advised at the time, and I must have forgotten. And then I said to the Ombudsman, well, which one is it? You didn't advise me because I was in too much of a rush? Or you did advise me and I must have forgotten? They can't have it both ways. The Ombudsman liked that when I had it all in writing, as well, the excuses. So the different parts of the bank. So there was the standard complaints that slung back you were in too much of a hurry excuse, so we didn't advise you of this clawback of interest that we were going to charge. It ended up 40 grand. It was very significant. And then when the Ombudsman took over the case, saying to the Ombudsman, he was advised. It's our process to advise him. And that was a written response that came back from the Ombudsman. I went, right. They don't match, do they? Which one was it? Neither was right. I had to wait for a receipt that they took forever to generate, so we were my mother and I, we were in the branch for half an hour or so. There was ample time to tell us about the fees, the clawback of interest that ensued. They just didn't bother. And then to say we did without any proof, and then contradicts the first statement. Anyway, the Ombudsman got them to, they paid back the fee, and they didn't put it back in the term deposit where it should have gone, because that was at a very high interest rate. They paid it into the normal account. They even ripped my mother off a little bit at the end, even at the end. They couldn't bring themselves to adequately, to correctly compensate. But the Ombudsman had to drag them, kicking and screaming. And the only reason we won the case with the Ombudsman was because of that inconsistency. They were caught out in a lie. They were lying. Commonwealth. That's which bank. That's an advertisement, a big campaign the CBA had for decades. Which bank? CBA, which bank? They don't care. Even that poor woman yelling at the guy, what's your name? I want to complain about you specifically and the service. Employees should have name tags. Should give you your name, give them your name. It's okay. We had a complaint about you. Oh, yeah, this and this and this happened. Well, is there anything we can learn about that to avoid this situation in the future? Usually it's a learning exercise, right? You sit down with the person, hear their side of it, right? But they refuse. Because they want the generic complaint handling thing that gets fobbed off. Their complaint handling process is we fob you off. Insurance claim process, we deny your claims. So, you really have to know from the customer perspective. I mean, you guys, are you getting value for money? An interesting question. I tried to raise it with our head of department. We had a recent meeting, a liaison meeting. Some students were there. David Steele was there. A few other students were there. And I raised it. There's not value having huge tutorial classes, etc. Other departments don't do it. Oh, not us. We don't have to have a ceiling of 40. Peter Bush says, that's another faculty, we don't have to do it in our faculty. Oh, yes. It's just from the customer perspective. So a good organization should care about the customer, not with these endless email silly scorecard things, but pay researchers, do research, and see it from the customer perspective. What about internal business? What about your processes? How efficient are you? How streamlined are you? What about innovation and learning? Are you training your staff? This is a huge criticism you notice I've had. We've had this whole development during my era here at the university. There's growth of a thing called the internet, you may have heard of. And there's this mushrooming of e-learning, and why aren't we, especially as the computing department, exploiting the technology and blending the delivery, having more of the flipped classroom idea. So why aren't we innovating? Why aren't we growing and learning? So that's a very important metric. So there's 5. 1, 2, 3. Isn't there 5? So the balanced scorecard is a very good way to evaluate an organisation. It's old. I'll just get a graphic up of the balanced scorecard. Image. 1, 2, 3. There's 4. So the financial perspective, the customer perspective, internal processes, and organisation. What's organisation capacity? That's the learning. Development and learning. And another paradigm, which is another good one. So I've got endless praise for the balanced scorecard, and I've applied it to Macquarie University. That's why I tell you these stories. I've applied it to Commonwealth Bank to make it real for you. And another way is the triple bottom line: economic, social, and environmental. So not only do we have to achieve our economic objectives, but what about our social obligation, our obligation to our customers, not to rip them off, our obligation to our employees to treat them well, our obligation to our community, to society. So that's very important. And what about the environment? What about climate change? Not polluting, especially greenhouse gases these days. So performance comparisons, we have targets, we look at trends, and we can benchmark against other organizations. And then we do the gap. We look at where the shortfalls are in performance. It's never enough. There's always a gap. And we go, yes, that's what our desired performance is, but look, this is all we're achieving, so we have a gap. We need strategy to bridge the gap. So sometimes it can be contradictory. We see the contradictions, bless you, here at Macquarie. If you reduce the entry standards, you increase the number of students. Oh, this is good. But then you've got less to work with in terms of the capability of the students, and standards have to drop. When standards have dropped, how worthwhile is that Macquarie University degree? See the contradictions. Very contradictory here. Sometimes we manipulate outcomes to achieve the performance. Sometimes we have to manage the perceptions, the expectation, the greed. It used to be if you were a financial advisor, customers would walk in and they'd want double-digit growth on their superannuation, on their investment. And as a financial advisor, you'd have to find what are the asset classes, how can I get you double digits? You know, we want 10, 15, 20% growth. Today that's impossible, absolutely impossible. It's going to be share market, and you're going to be exposed to Trump and he's the tweeter in charge. Because what Trump does affects the US market, which affects global markets, which affects the Australian market. So that's an example of perceptions and expectations, that they need to be realistic. And the measures change, of course, over time. What was pre-GFC. Let's call it pre-GFC. So what was 15, 20 years ago? You were looking at double-digit investment returns. Now, if you can get 5% reliably, I think you'd be doing well. Go into property. It's my advice. It's the only thing that reliably will give you 5% plus these days. We've talked about bonds will soon be negative. And safe criteria for evaluation: the suitability, the acceptability, the feasibility. Some good criteria. What's suitable? Suitability, we looked at the PESTEL, we looked at scenarios, we looked at Porter's 5 forces, we looked at strategic groups. There was an example of the Indian drug market, pharmaceutical market, a graphic with bubbles. And it had the low margin, low investment generic companies, and then it had the global ones, high investment, high margin, groups. We have it here, the G8. That's a strategic group. Paul Macquarie doesn't belong in a group. You've got the office front campuses in the CBD, cheap and cheerful. That's the group. I'd call them cheap and cheerful. Their fees are half of what you'd pay here. They focus only on overseas students because the half-price fee is not attractive to domestic students, probably a little bit more than what they would have paid anyway. And they have small class sizes, high staff to student ratios, no research whatsoever, completely, absolutely teaching focused. You just teach. And they provide a good learning environment. That's a strategic group. They're very popular, growing all the time, the office front. And then you have the G8, the Sandstone Universities, and Paul Macquarie. It doesn't sit in a strategic group. It doesn't know what it should do. It should be different. Although I want to be the same. I want the money. I want law and medicine, but I'm supposed to be different. Doesn't know. So strategic groups are very interesting. You see this with the cars. Never ever market a car that doesn't fit into the right category. Nobody will buy it. So you have all these categories. You've got now small SUVs as a category. It's a very funny one. Cheap little SUVs, little cheap cars that are built more as a bubble. That's growing, you know. It's a category. It's a strategic category for young people, you guys. You know, you like the idea of an SUV, but you don't want the big, you're never going to go off-road with it anyway. You're going to take your new car off-road, are you crazy? You know, they're not even, they're front-wheel drive. They're not all-wheel drive, you know. It's a new strategic group, new category. So people can compare. They can make a decision. So strategic groups is a very good way of thinking here. Looking at Vario, looking at your strategic resources and capability that has value, rare, inimitable, and organizational support. Looking at the value chain, how you're integrated with your suppliers, and sometimes even a cultural web. So there's all these different techniques for applying strategy. Johnson is very clever here. And examples, in terms of direction, it could be retrenchment, it could be going backwards. It could be market penetration, it could be new products and services, market development or diversification. It's a huge smorgasbord of choices, too many choices. That's why it's an art. There's no rules as to which are the right choices. Only what's going to work best in the specific context. Organic diversification, merger, acquisition, alliance. We just talked about that. So suitability, we need to better rank them, and there's an example in 12.2. We can screen them based on scenarios. Here's a growth scenario, here's a steady as you go, here's a negative scenario. I'll give you an example of a scenario. I read an article in the paper that investment in units, apartments in certain suburbs of Sydney did not do very well. That Ryde, Green Square, there are certain suburbs in Sydney where your growth over the last decade would be half that of houses in the same suburb if you'd bought a unit, and the reason being of the oversupply, the overabundance. I've got to fix up my mother's unit in Parramatta, and I was busy there today, so I've got paint on my hands. And looking out, I thought the development had finished. It's a Meriton building. It's 15 stories. It would have been tall in its day in the 1980s. And opposite, this is in Parramatta, where the river is, Parramatta River crosses Church Street. Looking out from a balcony are two massive Meriton towers. I mean, they're 50, 60 story easily, and they're very nicely architected. And I thought, oh, isn't that good? That's finally gone up and finished. And I was busy painting that. And it was so noisy. And where's this noise coming from? And then I counted. 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 new building sites all around. Yes. Selling is the right decision, yes. Because the capital growth was probably going to be smaller than, don't look a gift horse in the mouth, by the way, but smaller than houses. But I'm looking at the scenario. The scenario I'm looking at is Parramatta could suffer an overabundance and oversupply in apartments. Brisbane City, Melbourne, South Bank. Fantastic areas. The heart of Brisbane, the South Bank of Melbourne, Parramatta CBD. These are fantastic areas for jobs, for transport, for shops, for entertainment. These are hubs. These are business districts. And all shit investments. Why are they crap? Too many. Scenario. That's the scenario. Who would have thought? I would have never thought. I originally bought that apartment a long time ago. My mother bought it for me 20 years ago. And when I bought it, this was the tallest building. This was a high-rise. And when she was living there in the big Meriton, she was deaf anyway, it didn't matter, this big Meriton building up. Oh, God, when's this thing ever going to finish, Taller and taller and taller. Now it's finished. And I'm busy painting it up because we're going to sell it and everything. And why is it so noisy? Four developments going on that I can see from her balcony. I don't know where else it's going on, but 4 I can see. So that's a scenario here of oversupply. Who would have thought that investing in a hub in Sydney or Melbourne or Brisbane would be a bad idea? It's a bad idea if there's oversupply. So you've got to think through the different possible scenarios, and then what strategy would you use? Well, the strategy is if there's going to be an oversight of apartments, buy a house. The developer might want to buy it from you to build apartments. Or houses will become more rare because everybody's going to be living in apartments. So that's an interesting example of a scenario, understanding a market here. And we can use decision trees, we can look at our life cycle. So here's an example of a decision tree for a law firm in their current business. It's only house conveyancing, it's very restricted. If they want growth and they're prepared to have high investment and prepared to diversify, oh yeah, get into matrimonial law, family law, or acquire other firms. Big investment. Or in the worst case, stay as currently. So decision tree, that's another good way of looking at what are our decisions. And then look at what our culture is, what the scenarios are going to be, and then choose which paths. We can look at life cycle, depending on our competitive position. Here, depending on the stage, and different strategies drop out. And you can read that yourself. And how acceptable the strategy is risk. Risk. We need a portfolio approach to risk. Balance our risk throughout a portfolio of projects is a good concept. It has to meet our hurdle rate for returns. And how will our stakeholders, how will our shareholders, how will our board feel about it? So risk, we can do a sensitivity analysis here. The sensitivity looks at, as an example here, what happens to our cash flow if our production costs go up. This is a very low margin business. Ooh, very susceptible here to changes. And this is an example here of what happens if our plant utilization drops. And this is the base case, and we can see it. We actually go into a loss. Well, this was a very important metric for Ryanair, was the utilization. They have very high utilization, and I'm sure that's why I scored such a good price on my Jetstar flight. I booked it last week, not today, firstly, so you book it in advance, but the utilization was low. They were offering low fares to fill up the planes, because airlines have huge fixed costs in running those planes. Got to get some bums on seats. So that's an example here of what happens, sensitivity analysis, how they do their pricing. Here's an example of reduction in average selling price. That's again low margin. Gee, a 3% drop in price and pushing you into a loss. But look at this university, by getting the fees up and keeping their costs constrained and getting their fees up all the time off a huge base, the amount of cash, and they still manage to lose it all. Still manage to operate at a loss. That takes skill. So risk. Gearing is a risk. If we take on too much debt, the banks, because of the Hayne Royal Commission, have gone crazy now, and they won't loan money to anybody. It's gotten really silly. And liquidity. Here to make sure we have enough cash flow to pay our bills. And we can do a break-even analysis. And you can see an example there is in terms of where do I cover all of my costs. And that's the problem with Subway, is you've got a Westfield rent and a Westfield lease, say, and your turnover has dropped, and you want to get rid of the damn thing for $1 because you've got this ongoing rent liability, and you know you can't cover it with the profit from the store. It's very sad for those franchise holders. Many franchises have gone the same way. Even Gloria Jeans is suffering, which I thought was a good brand. Return, we look at financial return. We can look at the value to shareholders, cost benefit, real options. See whether there's a slide. So we can look at ROI, return on capital employed. We can look at payback period when we break even. So we're -10, we're -8, we are -3, boom, 3.5 years. See how I did it? I just back out the returns. We can look at profitability, looking at that cash flow, and we have to discount it. We have to allow for the time value of money, and they've used a 10% discount rate there. But financial analysis, it doesn't include uncertainty, risk. It's hard to see the spillover effects, and they can be not only benefits, revenues, but losses too, in terms of your project incurring additional indirect costs. And it's only as good as the assumptions, and you have to make your assumptions explicit in your assignment, please. So stakeholder value here, we can look at total shareholder return. You can look at how that's calculated. It's not a big deal. Or economic value add. That's another metric. It's a bit too detailed for this course. And cost benefit here, looking at all of the benefits, because it can be, well, for instance, firstly, in cost benefit for public projects, there's a very long term. And the poor Berejiklian government could not sell the stadiums project. They could not explain why knocking down 2 stadiums was a good idea. And I still don't know why we're knocking down stadiums. But obviously there's, they're not silly, our state government. and they've run the numbers. So you have to try and show the cost benefit. That's an example of not being able to communicate it. It hit them in the election, but
I think wasn't it the business case was that it was the same whether you knocked it down or you retrofitted the existing? So it's kind of like the cost of it.
yeah, but I know, and Alan Jones, his knickers in a knot, and stirring up huge controversy. Why is it controversial, is my point. The state government is not there to squander away the taxpayers' funds. They're funded by us through GST and through things like stamp duty on property transactions. That's a big one for our New South Wales state government. Stamp duties and their share of the GST. So they have a fiscal responsibility to invest that wisely, such as the Metro that we got. Fantastic project. And Gladys loves promoting her successes, and this is what's made her the Premier, and why they got re-elected is because they're building infrastructure. They finally got the George Street tram running. Is it running? It was in trial, at least. It's in trial. I don't know when it's actually running, but finally that's heading for completion. But the stadiums, they couldn't show the cost benefit. There must have been. So you've got the direct benefits. If the stadium meets the need of global and domestic sporting organisations, you have constant fixtures. Everybody wants to play their game, whatever game it is. I don't even know what games there. Is it cricket, rugby, soccer? Yeah. Well, there you are. See, I don't even know. You see, well, that, you know. So it has to suit the events. They have to be international. And there is a direct revenue you get from selling tickets to the participants. There's indirect revenue from the media rights. And what about the boost to tourism to the state? That's where the state government's particularly interested, is drawing visitors from interstate and overseas. Then they spend up big. So there is an obvious cost-benefit business case. But the government was just woeful at saying, what they should have said is, there's this X billion-dollar opportunity that we are missing out on because our stadiums suck. This opportunity is going to Melbourne, it's going to Dubai, I don't know where it's going to. But explain, where is the missed opportunity? Number one. Number two, this is what's going to cost us to bring our stadiums up to scratch. This is the payback period where we get our money back. And these are all the additional benefits. It's a one-pager, isn't it? Bad public relations. So real options here. This is AFIA, what I was talking to you about. The options approach here that a project creates can in itself may not be that attractive, but it creates options for the future, a platform for the future. Think about when Apple invented, better still when Microsoft invented Windows. That was their platform. Doesn't matter. Even if they give it away, which they did with Windows 10 originally, doesn't matter. It creates the platform for many other products and for the developers and for Azure. You've got to think in terms of platforms. So real options. We do an initial investment in a brewery, we invest now, and then later we can invest in distribution and then possibly later invest in product diversification. It's not a particularly good example. A brewer is a brewer. I don't know how it, but investing in a platform like Windows, you can see how it's very extensible. So real options, it brings the strategic and financial together. This is again what I've been trying to communicate in this course, is that context is king, context is everything for our business case, and so it has to align not only financially but strategically. as well. We can consider down the track. We can cope with uncertainty because it's an option and not an obligation, and it's very good. It offsets conservatism or short-sightedness, only looking at a project on its own merits, not seeing its future and the future options that it generates. And so stakeholders, there's always a political context. You have to understand the politics and gauge their reaction and manage it. In terms of feasibility, do we have the resources or competences, Verio, or can they be obtained? Do we have our pockets deep enough? And banks are not loaning at the moment, so you need good resources. Do you have the right people and skills, and how do you integrate them? Looking at the life cycle here, depending on the life cycle, it relates to the funding requirement, to the cost of capital, the risk, and where you're going to go. So here it's very high, so you have to go to venture capital, and there's no initial dividends. Whereas in this area here, it's a cash cow, there's high dividends, and it's funded through debt and retained earnings. Do people have the right competencies? If not, can they be obtained or developed? What we need to consider is how our structure, having the right incentives, the right relationships, training and recruitment, good HR stuff, and we have to integrate that all, especially the technology, which can be a nightmare in terms of this new direction in which we're going. And we have to evaluate. We need to avoid the confirmation bias, the selective perception, where we look for the results that we were seeking and we miss being objective. We need to be consistent. There can be lots of problems. Here, I think this says it all, doesn't it? Strategy development in practice isn't always a logical or even rational process. It's an art. We saw with H&M, we saw with Michael O'Leary. We're going to look at Amsterdam shortly, and as logical as we want to be, it just doesn't work. Good. Take a break. Amsterdam, get you into groups answering the questions. These were fairly meaty chapters.